March 25th, 1843. Hacienda Salado, Mexico. The sun beats down on a courtyard enclosed by crumbling adobe walls. 176 Texas prisoners stand in ragged lines, their faces gaunt from months of captivity, their clothes barely more than rags. They've marched hundreds of miles through desert and mountains. They've watched friends die of disease, exhaustion, and despair. They've survived hellish conditions in Mexican prisons, and now they're about to play a game with death itself. In the center of the courtyard sits a clay jar. Inside, 176 beans, 159 white, 17 black. The Mexican officer commanding the guard reads the order from General Santa Anna. 1 in 10 prisoners will be executed, not chosen by a court, not selected by officers, but by random draw, by fate, by the cruel mathematics of lottery. Draw a white bean, you live. Draw black, you die at sunset. Among the prisoners stands a giant of a man, 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle, bone, and barely contained rage. His feet are massive, size 14, earning him a nickname that will echo through Texas history. Big Foot Wallace. William Alexander Anderson Wallace. 25 years old, a Virginian who came to Texas seeking revenge for his brother's murder. A Texas Ranger who volunteered for a doomed military expedition into Mexico. A survivor who has already endured more than most men face in a lifetime. And now he watches as the jar is brought forward. As the first prisoner steps up, reaches in blind, draws a bean, opens his hand. White. He lives. He steps aside, trembling. Another man draws. Black. His face goes pale, his knees buckle. He's led away to await execution. One by one, the men draw. Some pray. Some laugh. Desperate, terrified laughter. Some close their eyes, as if not seeing the bean can change what it is. Wallace waits, his jaw clenched, his massive hands balled into fists. He's fought Comanche warriors, survived ambushes, killed men in hand-to-hand combat. But this is different. This isn't a fight. It's pure chance. Random death. His turn comes. He steps forward. The Mexican guard holds out the jar. Wallace looks at it, at the dark opening, at the beans invisible inside. He plunges his hand in, feels the smooth, hard beans against his fingers, grabs one, pulls it out, opens his hand. White. He lives. And in that moment, Big Foot Wallace makes a vow. If he survives this nightmare, he will make Mexico pay. He will make every enemy of Texas pay. He will spend the rest of his life defending the republic that cost him so much, and he will become a legend. But to understand how Wallace reached this moment, standing in a Mexican courtyard, drawing beans from a jar of death, we have to go back. To Virginia. To a farm in the Shenandoah Valley. To a boy who grew so large, people said he had the blood of giants. William Alexander Anderson Wallace was born on April 3rd, 1817 in Rockbridge County, Virginia. His family called him Alexander, though the world would come to know him as Big Foot. The Wallace family was respectable, but not wealthy. Scottish-Irish stock. Farmers, Presbyterian. The kind of people who valued hard work, honesty, and the ability to handle yourself in a fight. Young Alexander grew fast, and he kept growing. By his teenage years, he stood over 6 feet tall, towering in an era when the average man was 5'6". His feet were enormous, size 14. His hands could palm a man's skull. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke. But it wasn't just his size that set him apart. It was his temperament. Wallace was good-natured, quick to laugh, and blessed with a storytelling gift that would serve him well on the frontier. But beneath the humor was something harder, a stubbornness, a refusal to back down, a capacity for violence when necessary. He grew up hunting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He could track a deer through thick forest, shoot a squirrel from 100 yards, survive in the wilderness for days with nothing but a knife and a rifle. But Virginia was crowded, settled, civilized. For a young man with Wallace's temperament, restless, adventurous, hungry for something beyond farm life, it felt like a cage. And then came the news that changed everything. In 1836, Wallace's older brother, Samuel, and cousin, Major William Wallace, traveled to Texas. The Republic had just won independence from Mexico. Land was cheap. Opportunity was everywhere. They planned to make their fortune. Instead, they were captured by Mexican General Jose Urrea during the Texas Revolution, marched to Goliad, and on March 27th, 1836, Palm Sunday, they were executed along with over 300 other Texian prisoners in what would become known as the Goliad Massacre. When the news reached Virginia, it shattered the Wallace family. Alexander's mother wept, his father raged, and Alexander, barely 19 years old, made a decision. He would go to Texas. He would avenge his brother, and he would never return to Virginia. In 1837, Wallace packed what little he owned and headed west. He traveled by foot, by horse, by riverboat, through Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, across rivers swollen with spring floods, through forests and prairies and settlements that grew smaller and rougher the farther west he went. After weeks of travel, he reached the Sabine River, the border between the United States and the Republic of Texas. He crossed, and everything changed. The Republic of Texas in 1837 was barely a year old. Then it was hell. The revolution had ended with Texas victorious, but the violence hadn't stopped. Mexican raids crossed the Rio Grande regularly. Comanche and Kiowa warriors controlled the western frontier. Bandits and outlaws operated freely in areas too remote for law enforcement. Settlers lived in constant fear. Farms were burned. Families were killed or taken captive. Travel between settlements was deadly, and the new Texas government, broke, disorganized, and stretched impossibly thin, could barely protect anyone. Into this chaos walked Big Foot Wallace. He arrived in Austin in late 1837. The capital was little more than a collection of log cabins on the banks of the Colorado River. No paved streets, no real law enforcement, just dirt, danger, and desperate people trying to survive. Wallace had no money, no connections, no prospects. What he had was size, strength, and a willingness to fight. He took whatever work he could find, laboring, hauling timber, garden supplies, and he listened. He learned the rhythms of frontier life, learned which trails were safe and which meant death, learned the signs of Comanche raiding parties, learned to sleep light and shoot fast, and he heard the stories about the Texas Rangers. The Rangers weren't an official military force, not really. They were volunteer militia companies, formed by settlers to protect themselves when the government couldn't. They ranged across the frontier, hence the name, hunting outlaws, tracking raiders, and responding to threats wherever they appeared. It was brutal work. Rangers lived in the saddle for weeks at a time. They fought outnumbered, outgunned, and usually without backup. They tracked enemies across deserts and through forests. They pursued raiders into Mexico, Comanche hunting grounds, and places where no law existed. Many rangers didn't last long. Disease, ambush, and sheer exhaustion killed as many as combat. But those who survived became legends, and Wallace wanted in. In 1840, Wallace joined a ranger company under Captain John Coffey, Jack Hayes. Hayes was already becoming a legend himself, a young Tennessee native who was the finest tracker, tactician, and Indian fighter on the frontier. His Rangers were an elite unit, respected even by their enemies. Wallace thrived. His size made him intimidating in close combat. His hunting skills made him an excellent tracker, and his humor, dark, self-deprecating, absurd, made him popular with the other Rangers. Around campfires, Wallace told stories that had men laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Tales of his massive feet getting stuck in stirrups, of Mexican women fainting when they saw him, of Comanche warriors mistaking him for a bear. Some of the stories were true. Most were exaggerated, but they made Wallace unforgettable. He participated in his first major engagement in 1840, a skirmish with Comanche raiders near the Nueces River. The Rangers tracked a war party for 3 days through brutal heat. When they caught up, the fight was vicious, close range, desperate. Wallace killed his first man that day, a Comanche warrior who charged him with the lance. Wallace shot him from horseback, then had to fight off 2 more attackers before the Rangers drove them off. Afterward, sitting by the fire, Wallace was quiet. The other Rangers recognized the look. First kill. It changes you. But Wallace didn't dwell. He cleaned his rifle, ate his supper, and the next morning he was back in the saddle. Over the next 2 years, Wallace established himself as one of Hayes's most reliable men. He fought in dozens of skirmishes, survived ambushes, learned to track like a Comanche, shoot like a backwoodsman, and endure conditions that would break most men. And then came the Mier expedition, and everything went to hell. To understand the Mier expedition, you have to understand the political chaos of the Republic of Texas in 1842. Mexico had never accepted Texan independence. Santa Anna considered Texas a rebellious province, not a sovereign nation. And in 1842, he decided to take it back. Twice that year, Mexican armies invaded Texas. They captured San Antonio. They raided settlements. They spread terror across the frontier. And though they eventually withdrew, the message was clear. The war wasn't over. Texas President Sam Houston wanted to avoid further conflict. He knew Texas didn't have the resources for a sustained war. But many Texans, especially on the frontier, wanted revenge. They wanted to invade Mexico, to strike back, to show Santa Anna that Texas could hit just as hard as it had been hit. In late 1842, a volunteer force began assembling in San Antonio. The plan: march into Mexico, capture the town of Mier, and force Mexico to negotiate. It was, from the start, a disaster waiting to happen. The expedition was poorly planned, poorly supplied, led by men with more bravado than tactical sense, and opposed by a Mexican army that vastly outnumbered them. But Big Foot Wallace volunteered anyway. Why? Revenge. His brother had been murdered by Mexican forces, and Wallace had made a vow to avenge him. This was his chance. In November 1842, Wallace and roughly 750 volunteers crossed into Mexico. They moved south toward the Rio Grande. The plan was to hit Mier, resupply, and pull back. Quick strike. Minimal casualties. It didn't work out that way. On December 25th, 1842, Christmas Day, the Texans attacked Mier. They expected light resistance. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by over 2,000 Mexican soldiers under General Pedro de Ampudia. The battle lasted 2 days. It was brutal. House-to-house fighting. The Texans held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties on the Mexican forces, but they were outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and surrounded. On December 26th, the Texan commanders, Colonel William Fisher and his officers, negotiated a surrender. They were promised treatment as prisoners of war, promised food, medical care, and eventual release. None of those promises would be kept. Wallace and the other survivors, about 260 men, were disarmed and marched south into the interior of Mexico, toward Mexico City, toward prisons, forced labor, and months of suffering. The march was hell. The prisoners walked barefoot. They were given barely enough food to survive. Tortillas, beans, water when the guards felt generous. They slept on the ground. Some died of disease, others from exhaustion. The Mexican guards beat anyone who fell behind. Wallace survived. His size and strength kept him going when smaller men collapsed. But even he felt the strain. His feet, already massive, swelled from the constant marching. His body, once powerful, grew thin. And then came the escape attempt. On February 11th, 1843, while camped near Salado, some of the prisoners overpowered their guards and fled into the mountains. Wallace was among them. For days they ran, hiding in canyons, drinking from streams, eating cactus and lizards, desperate, free. But they couldn't evade the Mexican cavalry forever. Most were recaptured within a week, brought back in chains. And General Santa Anna, furious at the escape attempt, issued an order: execute 1 in 10 prisoners. And that's how Wallace ended up standing in that courtyard, drawing a bean from a clay jar, playing the lottery of death. March 25th, 1843. The courtyard at Hacienda Salado. The jar sits on a wooden table in the center of the dusty square. The prisoners form a ragged line. Mexican soldiers surround them, muskets loaded, faces impassive. The officer in charge, Colonel Domingo Huerta, reads the order aloud in Spanish, then in English, so the Texans understand. By order of General Santa Anna, 1 in 10 of you will be executed. You will draw beans. Black means death. White means life. There will be no appeals. The first man steps forward. His name is James Shepard. He's young, barely 20. He reaches into the jar without looking, pulls out a bean, opens his hand. Black. His face doesn't change. He doesn't cry or beg. He just nods like he expected it. He steps to the side, joining the condemned. Others follow. White, white, black, white, black, white, 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 black. Each draw takes seconds, but it feels like hours. Wallace watches. His mind is cold. Calculating. He knows the math. 17 black beans, 176 men. Roughly 1 in 10. Not good odds, but not the worst he's faced. His turn comes. He steps to the jar. The Mexican guard watches him, waiting. Wallace plunges his hand in. The beans are cool, smooth. He grabs one, pulls it out, opens his hand. White. He doesn't smile. Doesn't celebrate. He just pockets the bean and steps aside. He's alive. For now. The drawing continues. More white. More black. By the time it's over, 17 men hold black beans. They're given the rest of the day to prepare. To write letters. To pray. Some do. Others sit silent, staring at nothing. At sunset, the condemned are led to a stone wall at the edge of the hacienda. They're lined up, blindfolded. A firing squad forms. The officer raises his sword. The muskets fire. 17 men fall. Their bodies are left where they lie. The other prisoners are marched back to their cells. And Big Foot Wallace, alive, angry, and more determined than ever, vows that if he ever gets out of Mexico, he will make them pay. The surviving prisoners were marched to Mexico City and imprisoned in Perote Castle, a massive stone fortress used to hold political prisoners and enemies of the Mexican state. Conditions were horrific. The men were crammed into dank cells, fed starvation rations, forced to work in chain gangs. Disease spread quickly. Men died of typhus, dysentery, and despair. Wallace endured. He was assigned to hard labor, breaking rocks, hauling water, repairing walls. The work was brutal. But Wallace's size and strength kept him going when others collapsed. He became a leader among the prisoners, not because he sought the role, but because men looked to him for hope. He told stories, jokes, tales of Texas that made the men laugh and remember why they'd fought. He shared what little food he had. He helped the sick. He kept spirits up when everything seemed hopeless. And he waited. In September 1844, after nearly 2 years of captivity, the prisoners were finally released. Pressure from the United States, diplomatic negotiations, and political shifts in Mexico City led to their freedom. Wallace crossed back into Texas weighing 40 pounds less than when he'd left. His clothes were rags, his massive feet were scarred and calloused from months of marching, but he was alive, and he was ready to get back to work. Wallace rejoined the Texas Rangers in 1845, but he returned to a different Texas. The Republic was on the verge of annexation by the United States. The frontier was still violent, but it was being pushed further west. Settlements were growing, and the Rangers were evolving from volunteer militias into a more organized, though still brutal force. Wallace served under several legendary commanders, Jack Hayes, Samuel Walker, and John Rip Ford. He participated in countless skirmishes, escort missions, and pursuits of bandits and raiders. One of his most famous engagements was the Battle of Bandera Pass in 1841. Though Wallace's participation in this specific battle is debated by historians, what's certain is that Wallace fought in numerous battles against Comanche warriors throughout the 1840s and 1850s. He also became famous for his scouting abilities. Wallace could track a single horse across miles of rocky terrain. He could read broken branches, disturbed grass, and animal behavior to predict where enemies were hiding. He could survive for days with minimal supplies. And he could fight. Wallace preferred close combat. He was a deadly shot with the rifle, but he was even more dangerous up close. His size and strength made him nearly impossible to take down in hand-to-hand fighting. Comanche warriors learned to avoid him. Mexican bandits feared him. But it wasn't just combat that made Wallace legendary. It was his personality. Wallace was by all accounts one of the funniest men on the frontier. He told outrageous stories, some true, most exaggerated, a few completely invented. Tales of wrestling bears, of courting Mexican women who fainted at the sight of his feet, of narrowly escaping death in absurd ways. One story, which Wallace himself told repeatedly, involved him being captured by Comanche warriors. They tied him up and were preparing to torture him when one warrior noticed Wallace's enormous feet. The warrior became convinced Wallace was a supernatural being, a giant spirit. The Comanches cut him loose and fled. It's almost certainly fiction, but Wallace told it so well, people believed it. Another story involved Wallace being chased by a Mexican cavalry patrol. He hid in a hollow log. The soldiers rode past. But when Wallace tried to crawl out, he got stuck, his massive shoulders wedged in the log. He spent hours wiggling free, finally emerging covered in mud and furious. That one might be true. Wallace also became known for his endurance. He once rode over 100 miles in a single day to warn settlers of a Comanche raid. He survived being shot twice, once in the leg, once in the shoulder, and refused medical treatment, cauterizing the wounds himself with gunpowder. By the 1850s, Big Foot Wallace was a living legend. Newspapers printed stories about him. Dime novels featured him as a hero. Children in settlements begged him to tell stories. And Wallace, always a performer, happily obliged. In 1850, Wallace took a job that would define the next phase of his life. Mail carrier. The U.S. government contracted Wallace to carry mail between San Antonio and El Paso, a 650-mile journey through some of the most dangerous territory in North America. The route passed through Comanche hunting grounds, bandit territory, and stretches of desert where water was scarce and help was non-existent. Most mail carriers didn't last long. They were ambushed, killed, their mail stolen or burned. Wallace lasted over a decade. He made the trip dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with a small escort. He carried letters, newspapers, government documents, and personal messages, and he almost always got through. His secret: experience. Wallace knew the land, knew where water was, knew which trails were safe, and which were death traps. He could sense danger before it appeared, reading the landscape, the behavior of animals, the feel of the wind. And when danger did appear, Wallace fought. In 1851, Wallace was ambushed by a Comanche war party near the Pecos River. He was outnumbered 10-1. Most men would have been killed. Wallace fought his way out, killing 2 warriors and wounding several others before escaping. In 1854, bandits tried to rob him near El Paso. Wallace shot 3 of them before they fled. In 1857, he was caught in a blizzard in the Guadalupe Mountains. He survived by taking shelter in a cave for 3 days, eating dried jerky and melting snow for water. The mail always got through. Wallace's reputation grew. Settlers along the route would wait for his arrival, knowing he'd bring news from the outside world. He'd stop at frontier forts and settlements, deliver mail, tell stories, and move on. But the job was taking its toll. Wallace was in his 40s now, still strong but slower. His body carried scars from dozens of fights. His feet, already massive, were covered in calluses and old wounds. In 1861, the Civil War began. Texas seceded, and Wallace's mail route ended. He joined the Confederate Army, serving as a scout and recruiter. But his heart wasn't in it. Wallace was a Texan, not a Confederate. He fought because Texas fought. But when the war ended in 1865, he was relieved. He returned to civilian life, settled near San Antonio, and began the final chapter of his life. The Texas Wallace returned to was changing. Railroads were spreading. Cities were growing. The frontier, the wild, lawless, dangerous frontier Wallace had known his entire adult life, was disappearing. Wallace didn't fit in the new Texas. He was a relic, a man from a different era. But people still wanted to hear his stories. In the 1870s and 1880s, Wallace became a celebrity. Journalists sought him out. Authors interviewed him. And Wallace, always a showman, told them everything. He exaggerated. He embellished. He turned real events into tall tales. But beneath the exaggeration was truth. Wallace had lived an extraordinary life. He had survived things that should have killed him. He had fought in wars, escaped captivity, and become one of the most famous Texas Rangers in history. In 1899, a writer named A.J. Soule published a biography of Wallace titled The Life of Big Foot Wallace. It was part history, part folklore, and entirely entertaining. It cemented Wallace's place in Texas mythology. Wallace spent his final years on a small ranch near San Antonio. He lived simply, raised a few cattle, told stories to anyone who visited, and reflected on the life he'd lived. He never married, never had children. His family was Texas, the Rangers, the frontier he'd helped tame. On January 7th, 1899, Big Foot Wallace died. He was 81 years old. He was buried in San Antonio. Hundreds attended his funeral. Rangers, settlers, soldiers, and ordinary people who'd heard his stories. The San Antonio newspaper called him the last of the old-time frontiersmen. His grave is still there, a simple marker. It reads, William A. Wallace, Texas Ranger, 1817-1899. There's a ridge outside Frio Canyon, Texas, where Big Foot Wallace used to sit and watch the sun set over the hill country. He'd go there after long rides, after fights, after weeks in the wilderness. He'd sit on a rock, smoke his pipe, and just look. What did he see? A land he'd fought for, bled for, nearly died, for more times than he could count. A land that had taken his brother, his youth, his peace, but also a land that had given him purpose, legend, a life worth living. Texas wasn't easy. It never had been, but Wallace had helped make it possible. He'd tracked raiders, fought enemies, carried mail through impossible terrain. He'd survived the Black Bean Lottery, endured Mexican prisons, outlasted younger, tougher men, and he'd done it all with humor, courage, and those impossibly large feet. Today, Big Foot Wallace is remembered as one of the greatest Texas Rangers who ever lived. His stories, true and tall, are part of Texas folklore. His name appears in history books, on monuments, in the names of towns and roads, but more than that, he represents something essential about the Texas frontier: resilience, the refusal to quit, the ability to laugh in the face of death and keep going anyway. Wallace wasn't perfect. He was rough, violent, and probably exaggerated more than he should have. But he was real, and he was unforgettable. This is Texas, and Texas remembers its giants. If you want more stories from the wild edges of Texas history, the legends who lived impossible lives, the battles that shaped the frontier, the truth behind the tall tales, subscribe for the next Texas tale. Because the past isn't past. It's still here, still walking, still leaving tracks too big to ignore.